street that's proposed would have continued along to the western boundary. The relocated position of block A, B, C in this application means that that would not be possible. But the applicant has proposed a different route. It's less straight. It's not as straight as it could be, but it allows for the possibility of a bridge, a pedestrian cycle bridge across the railway. And this all comes from the High Road West Master Plan. I mean, and as I say, just to stress, it's not a specific proposal in the master plan. It's not a piece of guidance that sort of requires this route, this possible route across the railway. But there is the indicative master plan itself, the sort of spatial illustrative plan, does highlight the possibility of it. So whether it would happen, there would have to be a negotiation with Network Rail. There would have to be a landing place on the west side of the railway, and a sort of reciprocal, either a developer or the owner of that land agreeing to the landing of a bridge. So it's an aspiration. It's a longer-term aspiration. It's not a firm proposal. And page 121 in the report makes that clear and tries to address it. But what we say is that the scheme before you does allow for a bridge. It's a different location than was previously, well, not approved, because, or that it's in a different location. The possible landing and point for a bridge is in a different location than it was in the approved scheme, but it's not a firm proposal, so it's only an aspiration.
Yeah, so just to summarise, it's given the proportionate consideration, so it's an aspiration, it's not a concrete requirement, and the applicant has given that what we feel is sufficient consideration. They showed it's possible that they're not prejudicing it, but they don't have to go any further than that.
And Chair, my point about where's the heat coming from?
That was answered. It was yes was the answer given. Yeah. Next is Councillor Mitchell.
Thanks. Are you taking all remaining questions now? Okay. The council gets first refusal on 77 homes, but it states that 16 of those would have to be at London affordable. And my question is, why is that part of the application? If the council purchases the properties, isn't it a matter for the council to decide what the rent levels would be? Shall I just move on with the other questions?
Sorry, I was ready to go on that one. Yes, they would be given at the value of London affordable rent, but it would be the council's choice how we use them and occupied them.
So we don't need to specify that 16 out of those 77 would have to be at London affordable. It's a matter for the council to decide at a later stage.
Yes, it's the offer that the applicant is giving is that they will give them over at London affordable rent values, and then what we do thereafter is our own choice.
Okay. On page 93, it says that the applicant has council's opinion that the goods yard site does not comprise industrial land, and officers agree, it says. It seems to me that, this is a relevant point in terms of if it were industrial land, my understanding is the presumption would be for 50% affordable. I'm just puzzled by, I've not seen council's opinion, but, it was, as my understanding is, it was used as a sort of car scrappage, first of all, and then a site to assist with the construction of the stadium, and now as car parking. So if it's not industrial land, what was it then? What is it designated as? I have a question about water supply to the residential units, because on page 190, it says we're going to limit, or attempt to limit, consumption to 105 litres or less per person per day. which, having Googled average water consumption, that's very low. The average appears to be around more like 140 litres a day. I mean, for example, does it recycle rainwater to flush toilets? Is that how are we going to achieve that? And page 298, 299, I mean, Thames Water have clearly got major concerns about the ability to supply water to the development, and it says that they were unable to agree a position with the applicant at this stage. I had a question about the publicly accessible open land, which is on page 124. I mean, this was a point highlighted by the QRP. So paragraph 6529 says that the scheme proposes 8,870 square metres of publicly accessible open space, and then lists 6 particular parts of the development that cover about half that. So I wasn't clear where the other half is, although it would seem from the top paragraph that you also count neighbourhood streets and lanes, which I wouldn't really consider open space. I mean, yes, it's not built on, but it's not where you play or sit. And furthermore, in paragraph 6530, that provision is way below what is required for a population of 1,810, which is the estimated population. It's way below. Over 29,000 square metres would be needed. And then, frankly, I didn't understand the rest of that paragraph. It seems to be saying, well, if we didn't take that estimated population of 1,810, but took a population of 60% of that, well, then we wouldn't be so far adrift, although it would still be less than is required. I mean, I couldn't see the justification for, it seems, pretending that there wouldn't be so many people living there. We're talking about 867 units, so it's going to be a significant population. I was concerned about the references to health facilities for the new residents. I mean, the CCG put in a response arguing for 449,000 capital for expansion at Somerset Gardens, but the papers seem to be saying, well, actually, we'd only need one more GP to service this sort of population. And it does talk about potentially using strategic SIL, possibly at some later stage, but I mean, perhaps you could just clarify what you see as the intentions, particularly, I suppose, when the whole High Road West site is developed. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thanks.
So the industrial land point, I think you queried, and that's on page
It's page 93 where it
93.
refers to the council's opinion.
So this point is about, in terms of the London plan policy and the application of the fast track approach. So what the Mayor of London has done is said that if applicants can put forward proposals for a certain amount of affordable housing, they don't need to be subject to financial viability appraisal. And you're right that for industrial land, the expectation is 50%, for non-industrial land is 35%. So it's not saying that that may not translate in terms of financial viability into more affordable housing. It's just whether the application can be considered as a fast track application. What the club has done is set out an explanation of the use of the goods yard over time. I think everyone accepts that the Carberry Enterprise Park, the existing, sort of 11 industrial units are clearly industrial land, but the what the council's opinion does, and it's in the affordable housing statement or the planning statement, so it is the applicant has made it sort of publicly available, is to consider the history of use of the majority of the goods yard part of the site, and it concludes that it cannot be sort of taken as industrial land, given that, as you point out, it was a sort of goods yard, it was a scrap yard in the past. It was used for many years as a construction site for the stadium, and now it's a sort of hard tarmac temporary car parking. When we went to the site visit, that we sort of stood on and looked around. So officers accept, and I think GLA officers also have now accepted that isn't industrial land for the application of the London Plan Policy. So that's our position, and that's we've interrogated it and looked at the evidence and come to that view. In terms of water usage and the sort of target of 105 litres per household, that's a sort of stretching target that probably has its roots in the Code for Sustainable Homes from a few years ago, and which has been carried forward as sort of policy. It's achieved largely by the specification of washing machines and white goods in the proposed homes. There's no proposed grey water recycling, I think, as part of that, but it's really about the specification of the homes and the appliances in them to try and minimise the usage of water. Thames Water, again, on something of this scale, it's not uncommon at all. Thames Water, of course, are going to say, well, we need to talk about the water supply, and we need to reach agreement on connections. So it's very standard that Thames Water would make such a comment, and we've picked that up, and in our proposed conditions and recommended to you is that yes, there would be the need to sort of demonstrate that there is sufficient supply, and discussions have taken place with Thames Water, and arrangements can be met. So there is an answer, and there is a process for getting to that answer, and we're requiring that. In terms of public accessible open space, 6.529 and 6.530. The 6 spaces that are bullet pointed out there, they I think amount to the 4,473, and they are the sort of particular sort of spaces. So again, we're just being upfront with members and saying, well, look, the applicant has sort of claimed, if you like, 8,870. We've asked them to mark up on a plan where that is, and identify the particular spaces, and we've sort of unpacked that for you, and sort of part of our assessment, and that includes Peacock Park of 1,000, nearly 2,000 square metres. In terms of the whether that's enough open space, what we seek to do is, the site is partly in and partly outside of an area of deficiency in terms of open space. So what we did, the first, we assessed it first of all as if it was all within, and we make the point that yes, in terms of dissecting the policy and the amount of publicly accessible open space that 1,810 homes would require based on 1.6 hectares per thousand, it doesn't meet that, and it's some way off of it, as indeed the approved the approved schemes were as well, because it's a bit of a historic policy based on open space society standards from the 1950s. So it's very hard for London schemes to meet that, and I'm not aware of any that do of this scale. So it's not uncommon that the amount of open space doesn't meet the policy, but what the policy does is drive it and encourages it, and officers have sought to maximise the amount of open space, taking account of all the other things that we're trying to do in terms of optimising housing, getting a good layout, safeguarding heritage, etc. So again, the report is just trying to be very open with members about what is proposal and making a judgment on its acceptability. In terms of health facilities, yes, I mean, the CCG has made a comment and sought a financial contribution towards improving health facilities in the area. And again, sort of balancing all the different requirements, including, the need to maximise the amount of affordable housing that the scheme offers. We think that it would be reasonable for strategic SIL to be the source of funding for improvements to the capacity of primary healthcare in the area. I mean, this scheme is proposing it would make a contribution to SIL, which is obviously a national is a levy of about £1.5 million. So it could be used to meet various wider infrastructure requirements. We don't think there's a site-specific requirement to seek a financial contribution, a Section 106 contribution, when we're trying to do all these other things like maximise affordable housing and get open space and etc. etc.
Thanks. Councillor Morris, you would...
I picked up the same point as Councillor Mitchell about amenity space, so that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Corley-Harrison, you next.
Thank you, Chair. On page 60, in reference to the SIL payment, it says that, actually, in reference to social infrastructure financial contributions, the above are subject to review, that the scheme is liable to pay the current rate of borough SIL. If that were to increase, then the infrastructure financial contributions would absorb that increase. But then on 106, at the top, it said an approved development will be liable to pay the Haringey SIL rate that is in effect at the time that permission is granted. So why are we making that concession? Why are we saying if our SIL rate goes up at a later date, you can get off your social community contribution? Then on page 99, it talks about density, and that London Plan no longer refers to a density matrix. But then at 6.3.41, it says the proposed scheme would have a density which exceeds 350 units per hectare, I guess that is, which is a definition of higher density development in London Plan, and therefore it's important that physical, social and green infrastructure issues for this part of the proposed scheme are fully considered. Well, we've heard after Councillor Mitchell's questioning that those are insufficient. We seem to be over on density on a limit, which I'm not sure where the limit comes from. Perhaps it's just not in a matrix. So I just wanted confirmation on that. And then on page 100, it refers to the housing mix, and it says 83% are 1 and 2 bed units. This is not considered to represent an unacceptable over-concentration. Well, if 83% isn't an over-concentration of a site which is above density limits, then I don't know what an over-concentration is. So what are the limits on that? Because presumably the wider High Road West scheme has a significant number of 1 and 2 bed units across all of the blocks. So it's not like there's, a load more family units going in elsewhere. And then on 101, it says that policy SP2 references a viability is needed if it doesn't meet the overall borough target of 40%. I assume that is unless the fast track method is used, in which case you don't need to provide a viability. So it's 35% rather than 40% is my understanding of that. And then on the scale, I've not really heard any sort of comment from officers on justifying the kind of the increases in height from the previous scheme. So Block A has gone up from 21 stories to 32 stories, has it? Is that right? 50% increase. Block B's gone up from 18 stories to 27 stories, 50% increase. We no longer have the step down appearances that was part of the wider plan that was approved previously, so that there was a nice clustering that rose up. We just have four, if you count the other block, 4 very, very large buildings in the middle of some sort of under 10-story buildings. So I'd like to understand why officers think that that is now acceptable, when before we only approved. Actually, I remember after lengthy discussions about the being too high already, that we're now going 50% up on those blocks. And then finally on waste, this is very similar to what I mentioned when we had the Lend-Lease pre-app presentation come, which is we still seem to be relying on these large sites having sort of multiple Veolia lorries coming to collect, you know, the Paladin bins and wheelie bins and all that sort of thing. Why is there not a more future-proof waste provision on site where we have communal bins, servicing blocks, where waste is separated at source, it goes underground and it's collected by better means than with a grabber lorry or something like that, not bins that we have everywhere, because we know they cause problems in the future. And this is an opportunity to fix that now across the whole site. Thank you.
So you snuck in the one about tall buildings in the wrong category, but we'll let it go for now. So I think Sil was the first question.
I think the Depot Planning Commission accepted that the increase in SIL that the council is bringing forward would make the proposed affordable housing offer and the overall package difficult to deliver. And we've accepted, in terms of this application, that it's being assessed now. The affordable housing is based on the SIL levels now, and that it's reasonable to accept that if SIL goes up on such a big scheme as this, that the scheme sort of absorbs it and continues to deliver the amount of affordable housing and the benefits that are outlined in the report. So it's, you know, if you see it as a concession, maybe, but it's trying to help achieve deliverability and help the scheme to happen and deliver the benefits that we outline in the report. In terms of density...
just a second, Rob wants to come in on that.
Thank you, Chair. Just to elaborate a bit on that. So in terms of the SIL, by law, SIL has to be paid at the rate that's in effect at the point of permission. And so this isn't getting around that at all. It's just saying that should committee agree the recommendation tonight, as for any other application, it's subject to a Section 106, which takes some time. And whilst we will do that as quickly as we would do with any other application, there's always a small risk that that can nudge beyond when the new SIL rate takes effect. But because all of the viability work and all the affordable housing has been done on the basis of the existing SIL, it's a precautionary approach to make sure that affordable housing is not detrimentally affected by that scenario, although that scenario is unlikely to happen in my view. Our increased SIL rate has just been submitted for examination. It still has to go through that process and then to be adopted and then to take effect. So it's just to take a sensible and reasonable approach It's not about getting out of anything. It's just to take a sensible approach to preserve the affordable housing and the issues that are being discussed today. So I just hope that helps elaborate on that a little bit. Thanks.
Councillor, if I can come back on density, I mean, you mentioned, so all levels of planning policy now encourage a design-led approach to density. So there's not the sort of matrix, which was always indicative anyway, so it wasn't sort of fixed. The 350 unit per hectare figure is what is referred to in the London plan as being sort of higher density, and as I say, as being a sort of indicator that scrutiny needs to be high, and that people and local planning authorities need to scrutinise those issues to make sure that the scheme is acceptable. I mean, we do that as thoroughly as we can on all these various issues in terms of social infrastructure and open space. And I've answered some questions on public accessible open space and social infrastructure. So we have done that with a higher density scheme in mind, and the needs for that. In terms of dwelling mix, it's a similar, slightly better, it's a slightly improved dwelling mix in terms of family-sized homes than has been approved so far on the depot and the goods yard. So we've accepted that that 17% or thereabouts of 3 and 4 bedroom homes is a reasonable mix, and that smaller homes, 1 and 2 bed homes in higher density schemes, including tall buildings, is acceptable. So yes, there's quite a lot of 1 and 2 bedroom homes, but the amount of family housing is slightly better than what we've approved before on this site. So that's the sort of why we think that it's acceptable. In terms of viability and the 40%, yes, the council's policy is 40%, but the London plan, which is a more up-to-date development plan, includes the fast track approach, which allows for schemes that hit 35%. And we've talked about this, in this case, 36%, to take account of what officers think is the sort of industrial land content, to not be open to that financial viability appraisal. So there's been a shift in policy at mayoral level since the local plan was adopted.
I think we could maybe bring in Richard just to justify the increase in height and why that's acceptable.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, the important things about the reason why the height is increased, well, the design is changed, the layout is improved hugely. It'd be great to bring up the general site-wide site plan, I think. And what you've got to remember is compared to the approved goods yard scheme, that approved goods yard scheme had its main north-south street that provided access to all the blocks of the southern end was to run up the railway edge. So it would have been a pretty grim, dismal, one-sided street with buildings on one side and the railway embankment on the other. It wouldn't have had the necessary liveliness. This scheme changes that over by moving the main north-south street over to the other side of their site, so into the middle of the wider High Road West Master Plan area. So when the Peacock estate comes forward, it'll be a two-sided street with lively active frontages on both sides. It then pushes the tall buildings over onto the railway edge. So there's only a landscaped strip between the tall buildings and the railway edge. So that means that their height can go higher without having a detrimental impact on the surroundings. Remember, we're talking about the southern and the middle of the three towers. The northern tower remains the same height as previously approved. It moves slightly further north, but not significantly further north, and its impacts on the neighbours will be broadly the same as the impacts of the already approved northern tower. In fact, the northern tower is a huge improvement on the illustrative scheme in the previous site scheme that was approved for that site, where we had to say in that approval that the illustrative scheme would not be an acceptable solution to that site, and that it would be dependent on significant further design improvement before we would accept a detailed reserved matters approval, or as it turns out, a new application has come forward, which is a detailed scheme throughout. Now, I think that the design of all three towers is a coherent family, which also fits in, and there's a rather elegant curve diagram, so a double curve with the crowns and the slightly lower cloaks, which shows how they fit together and they respond to the design of the of Rivers Apartments. They sit well back from the sensitive context, the heritage, the listed buildings and the conservation area, but they form a coherent three towers, which have a strong identity, both close to and more importantly in terms of towers in their long distance views. So I think there are significant improvements in design, and they work. They don't have any detrimental impact. They work at this height, and they help create a better scheme with better ground floor, better layout, better network of streets that will be more legible, easier to find your way around, and create better settings for all the buildings in the development.
Thanks, Richard. I've got Councillor Ibrahim. I think we'd finished the other questions, hadn't we?
Oops, yeah, mine was just a brief question, and I hope I'll get a brief answer. It's to do with the low-cost rent. So you said that 77 would be available for the council as first refusal. Am I correct on that? But the total low-cost rent is 101. So who would be the potential owner of the other 24?
Councillor, yes, you're right. So the low-cost rent will be 101 homes, and a registered provider hasn't been identified yet. So the applicant would need to reach agreement with, Newlawn or any of the housing associations which the council sort of does business with. The 77 homes 77 of the 101, the council would have sort of first dibs and first opportunity to buy. That's an improvement. The two consented schemes gives the council 61.
So obviously, why? So my follow-up would be, why not give the council first option on all 101? Why have a split there?
Well, in a way,
it doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Well, the site allocation NT5 asks schemes that come forward in the High Road West area to make a proportionate contribution towards estate renewal. So this is the applicant, and where we've got to in discussions as being a proportionate approach to making a contribution to the estate renewal of the Love Lane estate to the south of White Hart Lane. So the approved schemes gives the council the offer of 61 to help with possible decanting. So it's proportionate. We can't require the applicant to sell all of the low-cost rent homes to the council.
So even though you can't require it, it would be acceptable if the applicant decided to give the council first option on all 101. So it's not,
yeah,
they don't have to.
Yes, I think if the council went into an open bidding process against other registered providers, it could purchase them at the market rate. So it gets a first option on these this selected number, but then when the other ones when the developer looks for a registered provider, that could be the council that they could come in and take further homes as we do now. So there's an advantage to the council. There's no disadvantage in terms of competing with registered providers on the remaining homes.
Okay. I did have them.
Thanks. So we have some people here to speak to us in objection to this application. I'm Thank you for waiting so long. I'm sorry it's so late. I understand that John Simon wants to speak first. So here you have 3 minutes, John, and then Georgia, you'll be after that. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm John Simon, and I live in Rivers Apartments in Cannon Road, where there are about 220 homes and a school. Although I strongly support the redevelopment of the area, I have serious concerns around the adequacy of all the due diligence that was done. It's a very extensive and complex scheme, and there were several outcomes which are described in the report as acceptable rather than good or neutral, following multiple amendments which changed the spacing and the layout of the new development and bringing it right up against the Rivers Apartments. Objection is based on incomplete investigation and mitigation around many of the technical issues, which would include the vibration from the trains, the noise, wind conditions, and general subsidence for the new basement works. So in my view, the gaps create a risk around quality and degradation, health and safety issues. And having gone through a nightmare with cladding, I'm very, much risk adverse to things like that. So regarding wind, there are no wind tunnel sensor measurements made for Rivers Apartments balconies in the development, and as you can see in Figure 1, so that degrades the balconies in Rivers Apartments and makes them either unusable or potentially unsafe. According to London Policy 7.7, all buildings need to have taken into consideration the environmental factors and make sure that they don't put us at a disadvantage. The closer proximity of the high-rise creates conditions that are more concerning for wind tunneling. Planners said they cannot project the impact, but haven't even measured the data to inform prediction. For example, there's limited areas of corner streaming deemed unsafe, but this occurs in a different location than the wind tunnel sensor that where there could be more areas. The suggestion to deal with it is to avoid using public areas, which is just not acceptable for us. From what is provided, you can also see that there are 5 times more sensors in public areas that have been flagged as unsafe for the public in this scheme as compared to the consented one in Figure 2, which is the information we're handing out. The vibrations on the train, the vibration assessment using the application is from 2017. Since late June 2019, a 50% heavier train stock runs on a train line, which causes vibration problems in the Rivers Apartments building. We live with that, where we're constantly having to deal with more vibrations. There's also noise and basement.
I'm sorry, but that was your 3 minutes. I know nobody's hearing the clock because we're so far away. So
that's all right.
Thank you for that. Georgia, would you like to? Thanks.
Following on from John, the main point of creating a master plan like the High Road West is to follow it. Planners in their reports repeatedly say that this developer is following the plan, yet the new proposal and the developer is actually doing the exact opposite of the plan in 3 of the 7 massing principles from 2014, shown in Figure 4 of our document. Principle 1, taller buildings located to minimise overshadowing of adjacent development, a clear principle there. Figure 5 we've given you illustrates that the depot has moved from 51 to 30 metres distance from Rivers Apartments. Moving a high-rise 40% closer is not an act of minimising overshadowing. Light and privacy are impacted negatively by this decision, and Figure 5b shows a render what that impact looks like on our balconies. If anything, this developer is now maximising overshadowing on the adjacent development. Principle 2, taller buildings should form to the edge of the development. Now, the depot tower is clearly not along the edge of the development. Figure 6 in the document we provided clearly shows that there are 5- and 6-storey buildings that are on the west edge of the development. The 29-storey building is built 10 metres in. There's no reasonable excuse for the developer to do this since the west access path has been removed. It does not align with the key principle. Principle 3, In the original plan, it was expected that Rivers Apartments would be the highest tower, with massing falling towards White Hart Lane. Shown by the red line that we provide in figure 7, the consented scheme shows that at least the shortest tower is at Goodyard South. In this proposed scheme, Rivers Apartments is now the shortest of all the towers. And if we were pushed for a direction of mass falling, you'd say it was going towards Edmonton instead. This directly opposes the master plan principle. Our residents are not unreasonable in our expectations for development. We did not object to the consented scheme, even though 11 unexpected stories were added to the depot tower. The consented scheme, we felt, sat just within the lines of interpretation for key principles set out in 2014. However, this proposed scheme, well, it actively decides the master plan principles don't need to be followed at all. It's gone 20 steps over the line, and the master plan for these towers is now unrecognisable. Late amendments to the design and lack of consultation are also concerning for us. The lack of imagery showing what our building looks like against the new buildings is alarming. Figure 8 is the best we could find before tonight. To us, this new design is not cohesive with our building's character and style. 93% of our residents preferred the initial design. Our residents do not consider staring at a dark red wall is a good relationship, as the planners have suggested that it should. The planner's report indicates that this updated design alone justifies breaking master plan principles and increasing density to excessive levels. That is outrageous to our residents, and it should not be acceptable to you as well. Given lack of community consultation on final designs, numerous technical issues that John has raised, we accept that the subcommittee should at least postpone decision tonight. If you decide to reject today, however, we've displayed there are clearly 3 clear points on the master plan that are failed by this application, any which of one you could use as reasoning for rejection. Alongside, we find it hard to fathom that Councillor Peacock does not have any conflicts of interest with this developer. From being a Spurs fan, receiving free tickets, and even if they give it as gift to others.
You've run out of time there, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry, but this is really important for integrity.
Yeah, our planning protocols only allow for 3 minutes. We have to be equal with
I'd like Councillor
application
Peacock
that comes
to say
before
something
us.
about that.
Thanks. Members, does anyone have any questions for either or both of the objectors, please? Councillor Colley Harrison.
Well, it's just 2 officers related to what was raised and whether the deviation from the master plan is a material planning consideration.
I think I'll just quickly take that one. If you go to page 97, the first paragraph sets out our policy on master planning, which I think is quite an important point. And it states where development form part of an allocated site, the council will require a master plan to be prepared to accompany the development proposal for the wider site and beyond, if appropriate, that demonstrates to the council's satisfaction the proposal would not prejudice the future development of other parts of the site, adjoining land, or frustrate the delivery of site allocation or wider area outcomes sought by the site allocation. So I think that's quite important to have in mind, that our policy doesn't say stick strictly to whatever master plan is in place. In this case, there is one. In other instances, we'd be asking for one to be prepared with adjoining landowners. So there's a lot of discretion here. If we were required to stick to the master plan, the scheme wouldn't be in front of you. There wouldn't be the previous consents, and that's really what's important to bear in mind. This is about not prejudicing adjoining land and ensuring that things deliver the outcomes that were sought in the site allocation. So I think that's then followed through in the next paragraph, that developments should accord with the principles set out in the most up-to-date council-approved master plan. Again, that's quite discretionary, so there's no absolute strict adherence here. It's about ensuring that parcels of land can come together to create a coherent whole.
Any other questions for the objectors? And just to say that Councillor Peacock hasn't declared any interest in this item tonight. So I think now over to the applicants. You have, I don't know, how are you going to split this up? Yeah, you're on.
Can you hear me okay? I think we have 6 minutes, is that correct, Chair?
Yeah.
I don't propose to use up all that 6 minutes. You might be pleased to know at this time of night.
You're not using 1 minute each? No?
While I was going to do most of the 6 minutes, I will introduce a couple of my team members for speed, if that's okay. And
Great.
just to say also that we have a sort of a technical table sat next door, so if members want any further or more detailed answers to some of the points raised in the objections, we can provide that
Okay.
if required.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I'm Richard Serra, Head of Planning at Tottenham Hotspur. I'm joined by Ian Lawrence, our architect, and James Boynan from Quad, our planning consultant. Just to say that the club has a proven track record of delivering high quality developments, and these proposals are no different. Our vision for these sites is to deliver an inclusive new neighbourhood in North Tottenham that builds on the regeneration effects of the stadium. We're not a typical developer looking to make a quick profit and leave. We're not a developer per se, really. And let's take Rivers Apartments and the Brookhouse scheme, which has been mentioned previously. I mean, this is a scheme that we delivered a number of years ago in partnership with Newlon, a scheme we chose to deliver 100% affordable housing on, and also a new primary school. And we're very proud of the legacy that that has created. These proposals build on that record by providing a very high quality development that will deliver nearly 900 new homes, along with restaurants, bars, shops, and cafes, which will be for the enjoyment of both existing and new residents for generations to come. As we've heard tonight, both sites have existing outline planning permissions, but were designed at different times and not together, whereas these proposals are designed in a unified piece and within a coherent master plan. The proposals also, crucially, have allowed us to improve the environmental performance of the schemes for development and to increase the amount of new green space within it. The proposals for the goods yard and the depot also respond to the Council's pressing need to increase the delivery of new homes across High Road West, perhaps worth reflecting on the fact that the original Area Action Plan had within it an aspiration for, I think, 1,250 new homes. And I think, as I understand rightly, the Council's aspiration now is nearer 2,500. I think the Lend Lease scheme goes somewhere above that. So there is a general sort of increase in the context of housing expectations. Proud also that our team and the scheme itself is committed to achieving London Plan net zero carbon, and in respect to the commercial elements, BREEAM very good. And we pushed our architects, as they know, to meet increasingly stringent policy requirements and to make these exceptionally sustainable designs. We're using high performance building fabrics and renewable energy sources such as 944 square meters of PV panels on the building rooftops. And the scheme, as we've heard, will connect into the den, which includes, and sorry for the technicality here, 79% reduction in CO2 emissions by SAP 10 standards and a 64% reduction by SAP 2012 standards when compared to the baseline Part L 2013 building regulations. The proposals will deliver 296 affordable homes overall, which is an increase of 70 affordable homes over and above the consented schemes. As we've heard, 77 of these homes will be offered to the Council on a first dibs basis. We've sought to maximise the opportunity for new ecology across the sites through the inclusion of an ecology walk in Goods Yard Walk, which you saw on the fly-through, and the planting of over 200 new trees. This, coupled with an ambitious landscaping plan, which includes a new public park, a new semi-enclosed square called Station Master's Court, as well as dedicated cycle routes, make this an exceptionally green development. There will be 18.1 square metres of open space per home versus 17.3 square metres within the consented schemes, an uplift there. And there's also a substantial provision of play space to make it a great place for families to live. In addition to these benefits, the development has the potential to provide hundreds of jobs for Tottenham through the provision of 1,700 square metres of employment, retail and leisure space throughout the scheme. Specifically, this is 270 FTE jobs during the construction phase and 160 FTE jobs during the operational phase, and that's from the commercial units, depending on the type of users that come forward. One of the many lessons we've learned from the pandemic, and I think this was picked up in planning committee when we came for information last time round, is the need to ensure that our housing is designed with livability in mind, and by that we mean catering for physical and mental well-being of our new community. And that's why every home has good amenity space, access to communal gardens, and high quality design, regardless of tenure. The jobs created will add to the 3,000 already created by the club already in North Tottenham through the delivery of the new stadium and the wider Northumberland development project. The new commercial spaces will encourage spend in the area, further contributing to the local economy. We have engaged extensively with the local community and with officers, and this consultation has heavily influenced our final designs, perhaps more so than any scheme we've been involved in previously. And in response to community feedback, the height of the buildings has been reduced. We've taken 2 stories off 2 of the buildings, and we've also reduced the floor-to-floor heights. So the depot tower, for example, has come down from 100 metres to 88 metres. So in actual fact, it's slightly shorter than the approved scheme. It's important to note. So we have acknowledged and responded to some of the concerns from Cannon Road residents, and we've heard them again this evening about the delivery of a tall building near their block. And we've heard also that there is already a planning permission on that site for a similar level building. However, we do believe, and they have been very, very carefully assessed, that the overall impacts of that building are generally acceptable and remain compliant with policy and principles of good design. And in the case of microclimates and wind assessment, the council has gone to the trouble of getting an independent consultant to assess that impact. So this has been taken very, very seriously and has been assessed independently. As set out in the report before members, officers agree that the architectural quality of the tall buildings is of a sufficiently high standard to justify their height. We heard from Mr. Truscott on that point as well, and also the likely effects on the surrounding area. The quality of the scheme is also supported by the Mayor. It is also worth noting, particularly given the height of the towers and proximity to the heritage assets, that there's been no objection from Historic England. And since submission, we have changed the materiality of the towers in response to officer feedback, as you've seen on the board, you see on the boards behind as well. So there is an awful lot of detail that's gone into the materiality of the scheme. I should also add that we've gone to town in terms of the fly-through and the visual materials in response to comments made at the last committee that we weren't providing enough visual information. So I'm hoping that we have provided enough visual information this time round.
Sorry, but that's time up.
I thought it might. Am I the only person that could hear my alarm?
You're closest, I suppose.
It's nearly there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions for the applicant and their team? Councillor Corley Harrison, I saw you, and was there somebody else? Okay, Councillor Corley Harrison.
Thanks, Richard. You mentioned the kind of the green credentials, so to speak. In the pack, assuming you have it as well, page 187, it references that fabric efficiencies don't meet the minimum standard in the London plan of 10%. And then on page 189, the proposed 8% green savings would be below the 20% that's called for as part of the local plan policy SP4. So it doesn't seem like a particularly green development, considering it's not meeting, certain thresholds. I appreciate you do have some things in there, but surely you could have gone further to at least meet the minimum standards.
Chair, if I might refer this to my architect, he might be a better place to answer this in technical terms, Councillor.
Sure.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep. Just to clarify on the performance, there's two forms that can be calculated, and I apologise if this is going into the technicalities too much. There is SAP 10, which more accurately reflects the direction of travel in regards to calculations of these performances, and that's supported by the London plan. There's also SAP 2012, which is a more historic way of calculating the alternative carbon factors. It's accurate to say under the SAP 2012 we fall just short of the B-lean criteria at 8%. Then under the SAP 10 calculations we actually rise just above it to 11%. This is predominantly to do with how carbon is assigned to electricity production. Since 2012 there's a lot more renewables used to produce the electricity, and that's the reason for that nuance. Apologies. However, recognising sustainability officers' desire for us to proceed with both routes, we've demonstrated the scheme in both ways. That said, the sustainability officer did accept the SAP 10 route as a way of demonstrating compliance, though SAP 2012 was used when assessing the carbon offset payment. Hopefully that does clarify, that answers your question. Please let me know if there's anything outstanding.
I suppose it does on my first point, but are you saying that under the SAP 10 guidance, page 189, 6.12.19, where you're at 8% and the threshold is 20%, you would be above the threshold on the other standard?
The threshold is 10%, not 20%. So we'd be below by 2% under SAP 12, but above by 1% on SAP 10.
Okay. So where did you get your 20% from is my question.
It's page 189, 6.12.19.
Yeah.
Local Plan Strategic Policy SP4.
So can we get some clarification?
Yeah, Councillor, I think it's the discussion that Sir Lawrence from F3 was explaining about the difference between SAP 10 and SAP 12 was about fabric performance and that sort of 10%. So the policy encourages and pushes developers to get the most lean buildings, to use the least energy as possible. The council has sought to apply SAP 2012, which is a tougher requirement. So that's why there are these differences. So again, our assessment is based on a sort of rigorous approach, and it's just below 10% for the fabric, achieving carbon savings from the fabric using that, and just over, as Mr. Lawrence said, in terms of if you use the SAP 10. The figure that you refer to in 61219 is about renewables and again a target of 20%, which is from the council's policy. Again, London Plan policy has come on leaps and bounds beyond the council's strategic policies, and it's the most up-to-date set of policies in terms of carbon saving and energy. The principle is to encourage, you first of all encourage lean buildings which use less energy, and then you encourage renewable energy. So the 8% is short of the council's 20% in its policy, but in the context of the overall London Plan and the hierarchy, it's still achieving a good amount of savings from renewables, and the overall figure in terms of carbon savings officers consider is good, and with offsetting it meets carbon zero. So it's working quite well on site, we would say, through the various measures.
So what's the London number?
Sorry, Councillor?
If Haringey's number is 20%, what's London's number?
It doesn't express it in that way. It encourages the hierarchy encourages a sort of lean, clean, and green being the last in the hierarchy. So the fact that it's connecting to the district energy network is the sort of next, the greater priority after doing all you can to reduce the energy use on the site itself. And in this case, the PVs on the photovoltaic panels on the roofs have been sort of optimized. There's only so much roof space, there's only so much space that isn't called for other demands like plants and living roofs, etc. So we think it's a good a good balance, and the overall carbon reductions are pretty good.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Mitchell.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask the applicant why they had requested a 5-year time limit for starting development, when, according to page 69, your intention is to start the construction in June next year.
I think it's in part to recognise that we have got an existing tenant on the site of the B&M store who are in occupation, I think, until they have an unexpired lease for the next couple of years at least. And I think the 5-year consent is entirely consistent with both the depot and the goods yard consents previously given. But I don't think that undermines our aspiration to get on and develop as quickly as possible. But I think it's in recognition that on part of the site we just can't develop for another 2 or 3 years.
But surely the time limit, you only need to make a start. So I accept that there may be parts of the site where you can't start, but other parts surely you could. Seems to be a discrepancy between wanting 5 years and to start, and saying you planned to start in June next year.
Sorry, I wasn't listening.
Sorry, I suppose I'm seeking clarification that the time limit that we always put into a application that we approve, which is typically 3 years, but the applicant only needs to make a start within that period. It's not about finishing it.
I think, Councillor, I mean, it's starting on a multi-million-pound big scheme. So would you start if you've got to negotiate getting out of a lease on part of the site? So I think officers have accepted, and again, particularly given the depot and the goods yard both had longer consents than the 3 years in recognition of the B&M stores lease and the need to get all their sort of ducks in a row before pressing the button on a big scheme. In this case, it also gives a bit more time for the council and its development partner Lendlease and the applicant to continue discussing how this development can fit in with the wider development of the High Road West, which some councillors have raised about, how does this fit in? Well, a bit of a longer period would enable, those discussions to continue and hopefully be resolved.
Thanks. Councillor Ibrahim.
Again, mine's a quick question. So on page 105, 6.4.21, it refers to the shared ownership, and it says, slightly confusing sentence, but I kind of see what you're trying to say there, but I want a little bit more elaboration on prioritising households living or working in Haringey with a maximum annual income lower than the maximum of 90,000. So presumably what you mean there is you're going to price, you're not going to go right up to the maximum. Is that's what it implies, that you will have some kind of a lower cap on the people that you will be prioritising for that shared ownership, but it's just not clear in that sentence what you mean. Lower than the maximum is also 89,999. Do you know what I mean? So I just think it's a strange sentence, but it's an important factor. So if you are going to say, well, actually, the people that we would be, because lots of us aren't huge fans of shared ownership, full stop. But obviously, if there is some kind of priority for people on a lower than that maximum income, it would be helpful if you were a little bit more specific about that. Is it 80? Is it 70?
Okay.
Is it 60?
Okay, thanks. I think officers want to take this one.
Councillor, on page 60, in terms of the recommendations and section 106 obligations, it's about marketing those homes to households which have incomes below 90,000. So the council's intermediate housing policy requires the marketing so that households with up to 90,000 don't sort of snuffle up all the shared ownership, but that households with lower incomes have the ability to get in there before households with more income snuffle them up. So on page 60, there's a recommended marketing scheme which is in bands of different incomes. So that's what I was trying to say, and sorry if it wasn't clear, but the 90,000 is the cap that the Mayor of London sets for shared ownership, but the council wants to encourage households with incomes of less than that to have the option and the ability to take up shared ownership.
Okay, sorry, I would need some more clarification because I'm not sure I'm any clearer.
Should I take Councillor Morris's question first, and then we come back to?
Sorry, it was a follow-up of the same question.
Unless your microphone's on, I can't actually hear you.
I'm happy to wait for Councillor Abraham.
Because other councillors have asked follow up, so I'm not entirely clear what you've just. So obviously, I'm looking at page 60, and you're talking here about. So what you're saying is that it's suggested that there would be phases of marketing it towards people within those bands. However, on page 105, that's not clear. It's just a very strange sentence which says a maximum lower than the maximum. So perhaps it would be better if that was clearer there as well, because it isn't.
Okay, well, sorry it wasn't clear in 109, but the recommendations are hopefully clear in terms of what we're recommending to capture in the Section 106 obligations. So those income bands and that marketing, if the scheme is approved, that would be how the shared ownership would have to be brought forward and marketed.
Is that clear now, Councillor Ibrahim?
Yeah.
Thanks. Great. Okay. Councillor Morris, thanks for.
Thank you. Yes, it was a slight follow-up on Councillor Mitchell's question. So, sorry, and sorry if I missed it, is there currently a tenant on a lease on the Goods Yard site, or can that be started now?
I mean, the applicant can clarify, but I don't think on the goods yard it's the depot site or the depot part of the site, and it's the B&M supermarket store in particular that I think that there's a lease arrangement which has got a few years to run.
Oh, sorry, I meant the site of, with the car, which is the car park at the moment.
Yeah, I'll let Richard come in on it, shall I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's correct. That the B&M store is just on the depot site. We do, I think, and officers might help me out here, have a few months to run, if not maybe another 12 months to run on the temporary use of the car park on the goods yard site, and that's obviously to facilitate different events and car parking on event days and things. So there will be an overlap potentially, but that hopefully will allow us time to procure a partner, procure a developer, and I think as Mr. Harrington has pointed out, if these schemes are approved and if the Lend-Lease schemes are approved, clearly there will need to be some coordination at a very technical level. And as been pointed out rightly tonight, these are our scheme is about a third of the size of the overall Lend-Lease scheme, but they are very big, complicated schemes. And there will need to be quite a lot of coordination across the two of them. And that's not going to take a few months to sort out, but we will try and get on with this as quickly as possible.
Thank you. And my last question was that obviously this is the second application that's come forward for the site, and is there a likelihood that there will be another application further down the line, or if you got permission today, is this likely to be the scheme you develop?
At the risk of putting everybody through this again. I think I think it's been sort of outlined in the reports, and we've said tonight. We've tried to bring the scheme up to date. We tried to make it, in environmental terms, perform better. We've tried to meet the council's strategic aspirations in terms of delivering more housing. I think this is as good a scheme as we can deliver at the moment, and it's hard to conceive of how. I don't say that arrogantly, but it's hard to conceive of how we could max anything further out. I think really this is a sensible response to the environmental constraints that we got on the site. It is optimized. I think it's probably a better use of an expression. No, we're not going to come back with a 70-story tower or anything else in the future. I mean, this, I think, is a sensible response, as you've heard and seen in the report, to our environmental constraints and factors. And we think it responds pretty well to the environment around it. And we think, as has been played out in the report, is a sensible balance of different pressures that we have to try and reconcile. And that's part and parcel of doing any scheme or any application of this nature. So no is the answer, in short.
Thanks. I was wondering if we were going to get there. Any further questions? No. So the recommendation is to grant permission.
Yes, thank you, Chair. As set out in paragraph 2.1, that is grant permission subject to referral to the Mayor of London for stage 2 and a Section 106 legal agreement providing for the obligations set out in the heads of terms and a Section 278 legal agreement, the details of which are set out in the report.
So, all those in favour of the recommend?
I'd like to move to refuse, Chair.
Okay.
On the grounds of height and density and design of tall buildings, the impact on the heritage assets, visual impact, long range and medium term views, and whichever policy this is, the fact that the 3 tall towers don't, from a design perspective, I suppose, they're not sympathetic to the lower, what you'd class as medium rise buildings in the directly adjacent to them.
And does anyone second that motion? A seconder for the motion. So I've got 2 seconders. I don't know which one to take. Right, Councillor Morris, second. Thank you. So, all those in favour of the Councillor Mitchell.
Well, I just wanted to be clear what we might be voting on and whether Councillor Corley-Harrison would take on board also the amount of publicly accessible open space, and whether his reference to the height and density incorporated the distance between the tower blocks.
Yeah, happy to take on public space, particularly in reference to density and the considerations we discussed earlier in relation to that. Also happy if Councillor Mitchell wants to add the proximity of the blocks, then I'm happy to incorporate that as well.
I think just before we take that motion, we should just draw members' attention to the presumption in favour of sustainable development, which is at 2.6 of the report, which members need to consider in weighing up any decision against officer recommendation. This is because our housing delivery over the last few years has been substantially below the target, and therefore paragraph 11D of the NPPF applies. In this instance, you must consider whether you're assessing an impact on a protected area, such as a conservation area, and whether there's any clear policy reasons that justify refusing the development on that basis. If you don't find that to be the case, as was set out in the officer's recommendation, you then have to consider whether the adverse impacts of the development would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. When looking at the framework as a whole, I would suggest that members, for a list of the benefits, those are set out on page 165. So that should be in your minds when making a decision, that any harm you find in terms of the issues set out by Councillor Corley-Harrison are weighed against those benefits and found to be in the planning balance unacceptable.
Do you want to come in, Councillor Mitchell?
Well, I just wanted to ask a question in relation to the written addendum. The top of page 4 also refers to the housing delivery test and concludes that the proposed development has been found to be in accordance with the development plan policies, and therefore consideration of paragraph 11D is not required in this instance. So I'm puzzled by the statement that it's in accordance with development plan policies, because as, for example, we've remarked, it's not in accordance with the High Road West master plan framework in respect of the tall buildings, for example. So I couldn't square that with the statement in the addendum.
The master plan framework is not policy, that is just guidance. So the policy is the M55 and AAP 1, which I outlined in a bit of detail earlier, which are about development not prejudicing future parcels of land. The site allocation, which is also a policy, says that it should be in line with the principles of the framework, but as I said earlier, absolute compliance is not required by those policies.
The motion, yes, Councillor Say.
But from what you said, quoted before, non-adherence to the master plan is a material consideration. The paragraph you read out to us said that.
Yes, non-compliance with the principles, if you find that to be the case, is a material consideration and a consideration of that policy. So you could find differently from us. We've weighed that up and felt that that's acceptable. But if you were to take a strict view that it was in breach of some of those principles, that then means it doesn't comply with site allocation NT5, and that all of the other benefits are not outweighed. You could find that.
Okay, so we have a motion to refuse this planning application from Councillor Corey Harrison, seconded by Councillor Morris. So all those in favour?
Chair, sorry, just before we vote, can I just check that Councillor Morris was happy to take, I know Councillor Corey Harrison took the, sorry, amendments from Councillor Mitchell. Can I just check that Councillor Morris is happy with those? She said yes.
Yeah, okay. Councillor Corey Harrison.
I wasn't sure whether Robbie wanted me to reference the specific policies after he read out the presumption in favour of development or not.
If you can, that would be helpful, yes.
Well, I think in play a London Plan D3, D9, H1D3, D9, DM6, NT5. I'm not sure specifically on the one that Councillor Mitchell was referring to with the space provision.
I think that's probably covered by London Plan D3 in any case.
I think we should just go. So the motion is to refuse the application as put forward by Councillor Corey Harrison and seconded by Councillor Morris. So all those in favour of the motion to reject, please show their hands now. All those in favour, against the motion to reject, show their hands now. So the motion was carried 6-4 and the application has been rejected. So thanks everybody. Late night for all. See you on the next one.